What is going on, party people in your house? It's your favorite Unc Anwar Richardson. I'm back. I'm back from Destin, Florida, where I spent the past few days down there covering the SEC spring meetings. While it was a beautiful place, boy, there was a lot of hostility. My goodness, this past week. And I wanted to make a video to kind of really express what was the biggest talking point while I was down there in Destin. So go ahead, hit like already to this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so, just so you get notifications when videos like this pop and get released. And so I learned really early in the process what this whole week was going to be about. And it did not take long for me to realize, and it really started on Monday when Greg Sankey, the SEC commissioner, had a press conference, and he really went at the other conferences for basically talking to them about, you shouldn't talk to me about the good of the game and all these things. And he was started firing back about, all kinds of things, right, that he felt like he's being attacked about. And I was like, uh-oh. Well, there's nowhere to go but up from here. But where this thing really went, guys, and of course, ladies, but where this thing really went into a direction of the SEC was really mad. And they let everybody know the reason why they're mad. And the main reason that they're mad is that they're mad at the playoffs. And more importantly, I know someone did an Allen Iverson, but more importantly, they're not mad at the playoffs. They're mad because they didn't get enough teams in the playoffs. Enough teams that they feel were worthy enough to be in the playoffs. And they went around and they looked at the landscape and said to themselves, well, this is not cool. This is unfair. And I think some of this really has to do when you start looking at the playoff teams from last year. I think a lot of this really had to do with them looking at some of these squads, and I really think, and I've said this before, and I think this has a lot to do. I think this has a lot to do with them being really mad at that Indiana got in. I think that ends up being the thing that people look at, especially like a program like the SEC, or at least a conference like the SEC, and they look at it and they say to themselves, how did that team get in? And we have other teams that we feel like we're worthy enough to get in. And it's hard for them. It's a kind of a hard, bitter pill to swallow when they look at that, and then they look at Boise State, right? And they're like, why is this team in here? Or they look at it SMU and they say to themselves, why is this team in here, right? And because they look at it and they say to themselves, at the end of the day, the SEC is a better conference and plays better competition than these other programs do. And how does an Indiana, when they finally face a tough team and they lose, how does that team make it in? There was a rub for a lot of these programs, most that I noticed in the SEC spring meetings. So much so, on Thursday afternoon, I flew back on Thursday morning, and on Thursday afternoon, the SEC, it puts this thing out there, and they want to show everybody. I'm going to put this on the screen for y'all. They want to show everybody that the SEC strength of schedule is unlike everybody else's strength of schedule, and it's kind of absolutely ridiculous that when you start weighing this out. This is what the SEC put out there on Thursday afternoon. It was a 7-page document to the media showing what they put the regular season gauntlet that SEC teams face in league play. And they say no other conference has a regular season as grueling as the SEC. Look, I mean, right here. When they look at, over the past 10 years, providing clear evidence of the rigor of its regular season compared to other conferences. The SEC is telling you nobody's playing teams like we're playing. Let me go ahead and give you that strength of record. You can see that right there. And then literally are doing a stat to compare themselves to the other conferences just to show you what they have to do, what their conference is about, and why it makes no sense to them that they don't have more teams in the playoffs. Here's another stat that they put up here. There's another one that they put that was interesting here as well. And again, they went to the average Macy rating ranking by school. And again, providing clear evidence of the rigor of its regular season compared to other conferences. In other words, why the heck are these sorry schools making it ahead of us? That's where the SEC is thinking. That's where their head's at. And that's what came out. That was on Thursday. Now, it started before that. It started before that because Kalen DeBoer made a reference about how it would be tough for other programs. And I'm paraphrasing here, right? How it'd be tough for other programs to have the schedule that they've had, that they had, right? And this whole thing really revolves around three programs. This is really what the meat of this is. The meat of this is the SEC being upset that Alabama didn't make it in, Ole Miss didn't make it in, or South Carolina didn't make it in, with what they feel like was even though they only had 3 losses in the regular season, they feel like that should have counted for something. And being really, really annoyed that didn't count when it should have counted the most as far as getting at least one of those teams into the college football playoffs, right? And so what the SEC is saying, like, don't you know who we are? Don't you know who we are? Don't you know who I am? Don't you know who I am? How many times, if you were a person that used to go out to, let's say, nightclubs or something like that, and you would see somebody trying to get into the club or bar or something like that, and they tried to skip the line, and they would hit them with the bartender, the bouncer would stop them and like, hey, you can't come in. And they're like, no, I'm da-da-da-da-da. No, you can't come in. And they finally hit them with don't you know who I am? Right? It happens, right? When someone gets pulled over by the cops and, hey, my dad does such and such, and no, I don't know who your dad is. Don't you know who I am? Let me tell you, when you hit somebody with the "don't you know who I am" line, one of two things have either happened. Either that person legitimately doesn't know who you are, or they know who you are and they don't care. And in the case of the SEC, all these other conferences are saying, in the college football playoff committee more specifically, we know who you are, we just don't care. Now, let's be fair for a second, okay? Let's take emotion out of this for a second, and let's insert some objectivity in here for one moment. Alabama and Kentucky specifically have no leg to stand on in this argument. And I understand what Greg Sankey is doing. I understand what Greg Sankey is saying. And I understand that he wants to fight for his conference. I get that. You want more teams in. Of course you want more teams in. But let's just be honest. Those aren't the teams you stand on the table for. Because at the end of the day, when you look at Alabama, the reason why Alabama did not make the playoffs wasn't because someone woke up one day and decided, you know what? Let's just screw Alabama. Let's just screw the Crimson Tide. No, the reason why Alabama didn't make the playoffs is because they lost to Vanderbilt and they lost to Oklahoma. That's the reason why. Start there, okay? And even if I remove the Oklahoma loss, and let's just play this game. We're just going to give Oklahoma all due respect and all due props of being an SEC program, right? Let's just play that game. Even though Oklahoma didn't have a great record, which they did not. You still lost to Vanderbilt. You still lost to Vanderbilt in one of the biggest upsets in NCAA history. That happened. We still have the image of Vanderbilt students, and I'm sure adults, tearing down the goalposts, going down downtown Nashville, throw the goalposts in the water, right? We have that image. That happened. You can't erase that. If you're Alabama, you got to say to yourself, okay, well, what do we do from a non-conference schedule standpoint? Well, you played Western Kentucky, played USF, and you played Wisconsin, which when you scheduled Wisconsin, it probably was a smart thing, and you probably thought really highly of Wisconsin at the time. Well, Wisconsin in 2024 finished 5-7. So, yes, Alabama can say to themselves, hey, we beat Georgia. And yeah, sure, you rose up and beat Georgia. That's fine. But you still also lost to Tennessee. And at the end of the day, you lose to Tennessee, you lose to Oklahoma, you lose to Vanderbilt. There's not enough quality wins outside of Georgia on your schedule, and that can't be the thing you hang your hat on. You beat LSU, and that's a quality win there as well. You also have Mercer on your schedule. So at the end of the day, it was easy to look at that team and say, you know what? We just don't think that they're one of the best. And I understand. We all, Lane Kiffin, funny guy, right? Witty. He's got all the jokes. He's got that dry humor thing going, right? And that's kind of fun. It's cool. It's cool to listen to, right? We're like that. But at the end of the day, you can't stand on the table for Ole Miss. Because Ole Miss lost to Kentucky, who we think of as one of the worst teams in the SEC. Probably, you get Mississippi State as the worst team. Kentucky's in that bottom competition at this moment. And so you can't knock that they lost to Kentucky. They did lose to Florida. I know that was late in the season. So you can say Florida maybe was a different team then. And they lost to LSU. And at that point, you lose it to Kentucky. If you're Alabama and you're Ole Miss and you don't lose against teams that end up being a huge upset, well, you kind of negate the arguments against you. But when you lose to those teams, it's really easy for folks to argue against you for that reason. And so it's interesting because, now South Carolina is a little bit different, right? South Carolina is a team that you could say to yourself, okay, maybe they deserved it. They lose to LSU, but then they lost to Ole Miss, right? And then they lost to Alabama. So they start off really slow, but they beat Oklahoma, they beat A&M, they beat Vanderbilt, they beat Missouri, they beat Wofford, they beat Clemson, which was a quality win at the end of the season. But at the end of the day, it's easy for the committee to look at it and say, would have liked to have seen more. Just would have liked to see more. Now, the thing about at least South Carolina could at least have an argument and say to themselves, well, look, our losses are nothing to be ashamed of. Our losses with LSU, our losses with Ole Miss, our loss with Alabama. But Alabama and Ole Miss don't help out South Carolina. Because if the committee is like, well, and we don't think these programs are good enough, and you lost to both of those, what is the committee supposed to do? And it's interesting because when you take a step back and you look at Texas, Texas ends up being a program that you say to yourself, okay, first of all, it helps that Texas didn't have any of those pitfalls or downfalls on their schedule. They were able to go out and do what they needed to do with only one regular season loss, right? Which was Georgia. But at least Texas could say, hey, they got a quality win on the road against Michigan. I don't care what you think Michigan is. or is it? But we probably would say that Michigan last year was better than Vanderbilt or Kentucky. So at least you can say that they beat the team. And yet they go out and they beat Colorado State. And you say to yourself, it was just Colorado State. At least Colorado State finishes 8-5. At least they're third in the conference. At least Texas can point and say they've got quality wins. And then it becomes the difference because one of the things about the SEC, and we know this, is that often in the SEC programs don't want to schedule tough non-conference opponents. And they just want to stack the wins. Texas kind of has the opposite approach because, yes, they played Michigan, obviously, this past season. They go to Ohio State. They still got Michigan coming at another point, right? You're going to have Ohio State again in the future. They've got Notre Dame on the schedule. Hell, now they got Arizona State, who, when they scheduled it, you thought to yourself, who the hell is Arizona State? And now you look at it and say, damn, they got Arizona State, right? And so, at least from a Texas perspective, you can say, hey, they're scheduling good quality teams. And look, remember a couple of years ago, Alabama loses to Texas, but the committee didn't hold that against them. But this past year, when you lose against Vanderbilt, yeah, the committee's going to hold it against you. And if you're SEC, you can't play dumb and act like that didn't happen. And so that's what the problem that the SEC is running against, kind of as they stomp their feet and kind of as they say, you know what, we're the SEC. Do you know who we are? Do you know who I am? That's where the rub comes in when the SEC kind of comes up with this. Well, I would say the SEC, because the SEC didn't necessarily come up with it. But when you start talking about the playoff models and the potential playoff, when they're going to make the proposal of a 4-4-2-2-1. No, those were not lotto numbers, but trying to give you those numbers, right? Or was it a pick 3 or pick 4? I don't play those kind of things, but nonetheless, where people want 4 automatic bids for the SEC and the Big Ten. That's 8. 2 for the ACC, 2 for the Big 12, and then 1 for the group of 16 or Notre Dame, and then 3 at-large bids. You got these other conferences like the ACC and the Big 12 looking at you like, have you lost your damn mind? We ain't gonna do that. What? Are you serious? No. Why would we just automatically grant you stuff because you think you're the big bad SEC, therefore you deserve more? And the SEC is saying, look, we play better competition than you guys. That shouldn't count. And other conferences saying, yeah, what competition? Kentucky, Vanderbilt? That's what you're going to beat your chest about? Hell no. We are not going to give you 4 automatic bids. Now, look, it's negotiation, right? You ask for the world. You negotiate your way down. Maybe you negotiate your way down to 3, something to that effect. But that's where the whole new world of especially when they start wanting to go to 16 teams. Because that's the thing, when we start going to 16 teams, it's because 16 teams is going to happen, right? There's just, at the end of the day, they may debate how it looks at this moment, but there's no debating this. If there's more money to be made, they're going to find a way to get it. They don't turn down money. Nobody says, you know what? I got so much money, I don't need any more. No. If there's an opportunity to make more money and have more games, they will definitely do that. How that happens, now there's a conversation to be had, and that's a whole totally different video on what that may or may not look like. But at the end of the day, what the SEC really wanted to make sure and let everybody know during SEC spring meetings this week is we're mad. We're big mad. Even to somewhat hinting where there was a conversation where it's like, man, sometimes people just ask us, man, why are we even in the NCAA? I mean, it's not like the SEC is going to take the ball and run home, but even when the SEC is trying to partner up with the Big Ten and really make kind of a super conference, or they want to play games against each other and really kind of just test the waters and push the boundaries and push the limits and all these kind of things. Here's the one thing I would say for you as a Texas fan who watches this video. There's two things you should be happy about. One, you got a coach in a program that you're not sitting there worried about, well, why the hell aren't we some sort of, wild card team that kind of deserves it kind of thing, and arguing, maybe we should be in. Because at the end of the day, Texas has done and handled its business over the past couple of years, where it was a 4-team format, or even last season when they expanded to 12. The Texas did what they needed to do in that regular season, and then losing in the conference championship game. At that point, they still get in. Then there's still, of course, they win. So at least you have a coach and you have a staff that's kind of not putting you in a situation like these other programs where you kind of have to talk yourself into why you should be in, as opposed to, hey, it's clear, it's obvious, it's a no-brainer, but you have to convince people months after the fact that maybe you got screwed or something like that, ignoring some of the facts that go along with that. So at least Sark has got your program in a good situation. The second thing, though, is eventually there'll be some sort of compromise. Eventually there'll be a compromise. That's within it. But until we get to that compromise point, you're going to hear more about the SEC saying we deserve more teams in, and these other programs, aka these other conferences, just aren't on our level. But like I said, when you go to, do you know who I am? Usually it doesn't end well. Because in this case, they know who the SEC is. And at the end of the day, some of the conferences and the playoff committee, they just don't care.